Thank you for joining our Information Technology Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Subbu Vis, our VP of IT and Virtualization, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, direction for post-webinar collaboration, and our discussion topic, guidelines for qualifying infrastructure services for life sciences. We're proud to have Subbu presenting for our team today. He has 15 years in technology and regulated life science domains. Subbu leads the USDM IT infrastructure practice and is a subject matter expert for VMware as well as SharePoint. He has presented on many compliance and technology topics worldwide, including compliance over the cloud, Part 11 compliance, manufacturing systems, IT systems, validation, risk-based approaches, SharePoint in the life sciences, and software development. On a more personal level, he is a proud geek and the father of twins. You might be interested to know he's also a rock star. U.S. data management is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality, and regulatory compliance professional services. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we're a compliance partner for many best-of-breed vendors, including Agilent Technologies, Sparta Systems, OpenText, Oracle, and SAP. We've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients, and we're the preferred preferred compliance partners for small, mid-tier, and large life science companies. Our various dedicated practices include, of course, IT and virtualization, quality and auditing, ECM, ERP, PLM, EQM, manufacturing automation and equipment, clinical and drug safety, nutraceuticals, our business intelligence, project management, GRC, and our laboratory practice, which includes both systems and equipment. The content will be covered in approximately 30 minutes today, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board on the lower left of your screen, or you can join the discussion on LinkedIn and post questions there. The overall goal of the webinar is to facilitate discussion, share ideas, provide the platform, and explore solutions together. We appreciate you taking the time to join us, and we'll give you just one more look at our rock star. And with that, I'll turn it over to Subbu.
That was definitely an interesting introduction. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. This is really a very quick presentation. We have only about 30 minutes, and this is it's an enormous topic, and aptly posted in that third bullet, how to handle this unwieldy behemoth. I promised Becky that I would say the words unwieldy behemoth. So, please direct queries, directly to me on a private message chat, and I will try and answer them after the session, like Becky mentioned. But if I'm not able to get a wordy response in, I will definitely post them on our LinkedIn page, so we can actually have an ongoing discussion, and it's not something that we just we talk about this for 2 minutes and then forget about it. We can actually engage in a more meaningful conversation. So essentially, I'd like to kind of focus on what I want to talk about. I'm going to briefly touch upon that. I'm only going to touch on some high-level important points. Why infrastructure qualification is important at all. How you go about doing something like this. And how to kind of stay in a qualified state after you actually get done with this task. Like I mentioned, I'm going to focus on the big picture. I'm really not going to talk about the low-level infrastructure items like servers, switches, routers, and data centers, and all of that. Main reason being, I'd rather focus on the big-ticket items in this short time. They're harder to comprehend, harder to qualify. They're closer to the data, closer to the security of your data, etc. So let's try and talk about that a little bit more, less about some of the lower level infrastructure services. I'm also going to touch upon the deliverables we would need to go about something like this, and hopefully that clarifies things as well. Why do I care, or why do you care in this particular instance? There's definitely a lot more scrutiny on infrastructure qualification these days, perhaps because more and more companies are outsourcing their infrastructure. They're either using managed services or using infrastructure as a service, if not even software as a service. It kind of calls into question. You could validate your system, and ensure compliance as much as you want, but if it sits on a completely uncontrolled or unqualified infrastructure, it kind of calls into question how compliant your validated system truly is. As you all know, we're all depending on these underlying infrastructure items more and more. 10 years ago, it used to be a single server sitting on a manufacturing line or sitting somewhere, and it was closed. It was all part of one system. But of course now, the application software resides on a virtual machine, which is managed by a virtual infrastructure, and the underlying data is sitting on a storage area network, and the whole array of infrastructure services that's supported. There's Active Directory that's providing authentication and security, and so on. So we really have to address all of those underlying base infrastructure items to kind of make sure that your end-use application is truly validated. And of course, there's greater scrutiny these days on the infrastructure by the agencies, and Annex 11 is just calls it out in quite plain English. Thou shalt qualify your infrastructure. Thou shalt test your backup and recovery. Thou shalt ensure your disaster recovery process is tested, etc. It's very, very plain English, and I think that's just super awesome. The monsters. As you can see, those two monsters, it is really difficult and big to handle. It's almost as difficult to qualify an infrastructure as to get a monster suit on one-year-old twins and try to get them to actually look at the camera. It's absolutely impossible, and that task is equivalent to trying to qualify an infrastructure sometimes, it seems. But hopefully I'll try and make that a little easier throughout this process. So I do talk about a few, I want to touch upon a few examples. There was the case of the unable to wrap my hands around the moving behemoth. There was one company which was really growing rapidly, and they were really, really growing fast. And before we came in, they were constantly in an assessment phase. They could never get their hands around, where their infrastructure was at any given point in time. They were constantly adding new hosts, constantly adding new filers, new storage. They were expanding like crazy. Different facilities, different sites would have different platforms, etc. It was just growing too fast. And we told them, hey, if you're not able to qualify, and they hadn't qualified their infrastructure, and they hadn't qualified any of their infrastructure pieces. They were just growing too fast, and they started out as a small shop, and they grew really quickly. So we told them, hey, let's just use an accretive approach. Let's start at one of your data centers, qualify the underlying infrastructure services there, and then we'll add on, or we'll accrete, and we'll grow slowly. And that's an easier way of approaching the problem than trying to put your arms around this huge monster. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide as well, next couple of slides. There's the other case of the acquisitive company. They're very similar to the above. They were also trying to qualify some of their infrastructure services, but they were constantly acquiring, obviously, with this recession, the Great Recession of the last 3-4 years, some of the smarter companies have been acquiring. They've been cash heavy, and they've been acquiring. And there was one such company who was acquiring like crazy, and similar to the above situation where, they were constantly, trying to put their arms around this. Plus, they also had the issue of different standards. Company A would acquire company B. Company B would have a different SAN vendor, different virtualization vendor, or their Active Directory, one was in 2003, the other was 2008, whatever. There were just different compatibility issues or different standards, and how do you qualify that? There's also the case of the multiple standards. Another company where it was just constantly, everybody was in a slightly different version. Each data center was in a different version of the underlying infrastructure. So again, how do you put your hand around this? Sorry, I got distracted for a second there. I'm looking at my son's pouty face. I have a Pyromaniac cop friend who's the sheriff of a couple of stations in Riverside County, South LA. He's a Pyromaniac, and he told me this, or he pointed me to this, or some famous person quoted this. But again, take it with a pinch of salt. He's a Pyromaniac. So there are very few problems that cannot be solved through a suitable application of high explosives. Well, I don't expect you to throw explosive into your network infrastructure, but the idea is to kind of take it and break it and slice it into manageable pieces or services. If you try and attack the whole problem, it's going to be very difficult to split it into individual services, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. The other approach, and I was talking about this a little bit with the three examples, is the accretive approach. You build your gold standard and you expand outwards. So for example, you have you qualify your primary data center. You qualify, say, your storage area network there. Once you've established your gold standard of how you're going to go about doing that particular service, you go and use the processes and procedures and the qualification that you've developed for your primary data center, and then you slowly go on attacking all of the other data centers and bring them into the fold. It's kind of very similar to how, when my twins were very small, I had them around this little playpen, caged off, so they could make their mess over there. But over time, they have slowly expanded that mess and grown that mess all throughout the house. So if you can equate a twin's mess to qualification of a network, you can kind of get the picture. So what is a service? You divide your network into logical or physical chunks of the infrastructure that perform a particular function. This can be quite granular or quite high level. It purely depends on how you want to break this up and the size of your organization as well, or the size of your data center as well. For instance, some pretty straightforward services is the SAN. What does the SAN do? It provides a storage service. It provides you logical units of logical chunks, which you can use, like various systems can use. I'm sorry, I got a little distracted there. The Active Directory, it provides directory services, authentication, security, etc. Database services, you want to use an Oracle database or a SQL database. It provides certain functions. But within that, you can go into a little granularity and say, hey, I want to replicate my database, and that's a particular function or a service that Oracle provides by, something called Oracle Data Guard. Hey, that's a small piece that I also want to roll into my Oracle database service qualification, or I want to use it as a separate service in and of itself, meaning I want to create a service called data replication services. And I want to qualify all technologies that I'm using for replicating data from site A to site B. Maybe site B is my backup site or my disaster recovery site. Virtualization can be another service. Backup archival can be another service, etc. So you see what I'm getting at. So you divide your network. Essentially, what you provide, what the infrastructure team or your IT infrastructure team provides as a service to the rest of your organization, you use that. You use those logical chunks or physical chunks and say, hey, let's qualify this as a service so that systems that are validated that use or depend on these services system, your HPLC system, is based on Oracle database. Hey, it needs the Oracle database. My HPLC system also needs backup and recovery. Let's tap into the backup and recovery service, etc. So, you kind of go with that approach and qualify each service. And like I mentioned, services can be made up of a service can be made up of other services as well. And there was a little whimsical here. I went into some kind of fractal symmetry triangles made up of a bunch of other triangles. A good example of this is in a particular client company. This is how we qualify their DR services, or your disaster recovery services. For disaster recovery, you need many things. You need, for example, replication of your transactional data. And so that can be one service. Database replication can be a service. The SAN, where the VM, the virtual machines reside, the VMDK files, etc. And also where, some transactional data could reside, can also be replicated using, snap mirror technologies or something. And maybe that's another, data replication service that we qualify. That's part of the DR services. A recovery automation tool like Site Recovery Manager or something like that can be another sub-service of the disaster recovery service. A load balancing tool. Hey, company A users log on to my Agilent HPLC system using, companya.com. I just want to be able to load balance that and send them to the disaster recovery site without much, without them even knowing that they're actually running out of the other site, etc. So that could be another tool that you want to, or another service that falls under the disaster recovery service, etc. But you get the general idea. But the splitting up of the service, I think, is an important aspect, and this is a strategic aspect of your infrastructure qualification that you have to do right. It needs a lot of clarity of thought. It needs it needs proper segmentation. How do you really divide these up? How do different services interplay and interact with each other? And how am I, as a service, providing functionality to a validated system? And how can I capture that very well? Excuse me. So, okay, well, I have a service. I've defined the service. Now what? It kind of falls into a very, very familiar diagram, or a familiar figure that we've been taught for a while now. The old V validation figure. We can kind of use that same approach for qualification as well. You can have a qual plan at the left-hand side, top left, and this qualification plan / risk assessment. You can cover your risks, the impact that the service has on GXP or on data integrity, etc. Because not all services are built equal. Some of them are going to touch your data more critically. Some of them are not. Some of them provide security, like the Active Directory, and it's crucial. It's also, like the Active Directory's authentication is what is used to say that, hey, my system is Part 11 compliant. Every time I go, I have to type in my username and password again. Guess what? Where's that coming from? That's coming from your Active Directory. So it's very crucial. It's a critical part of your infrastructure. But some of them are not. But in your qual plan, you would also address things like, what kind of an approach are you taking? Are you taking an accretive approach? Like I talked about earlier, we qualify our primary data center and then we slowly grow. Or even address things like, do we have a qualification environment and a production environment, where we test everything out in our qual and we really don't touch our production? All of those things would go into that. Sometimes there's a need to have a qualification environment, and a lot of times it's not feasible to have a qualification environment, essentially a distinct environment where you would run your tests, and then your production environment is just IQ'd. I hope you get the difference. So we had working for a particular customer, and they have their storage area network, and there's really no split between their qualification environment and production environment. They can't afford to have a distinct storage area network, however small, used just for qualification testing purposes. So we did all of the testing on the actual production machines, and we just segregated some of our testing into separate LUNs or logical units, and we managed it that way. And that can be done. But within the same organization, we wanted to do, they couldn't afford to instantiate a new backup system as well. They were using NetBackup, and backup services were qualified as a service. So we were planning to do production testing for everything. How do you back up a Linux OS? How do you back up a Windows OS? And what is the retention? How do you retrieve it, etc.? Retrieve it to tape, retrieve it from first stage disk storage, etc. But then we also wanted to do a catalog backup restore, meaning the catalog backups. The catalogs are essentially the indexes of all of the media that's been backed up. And if you run that recovery, you're actually overwriting your existing data of all of your backup information, which is kind of a destructive test, and you really don't want that to mess up your existing backup infrastructure. So we had to set up like a qualification environment so that we could just prove the catalog restore part of it. So all of those strategies and thoughts would go into your qual plan, very similar to like a validation plan, how you would approach it as well. The functional spec, you notice there is no user requirement spec because a user requires something from a system. The system might in turn require something from the infrastructure, which is what we're talking about. The system requires backup functionality from our backup service. It requires Active Directory authentication, etc., etc. The user just cares that the system has security and the system data can be backed up. He doesn't care where it's coming from. So the functional specs will document all that we need from our infrastructure service. But we shouldn't go crazy here as well. We should try and qualify or try and document the functionality that we are, the most of the functionality that we are using today. We shouldn't try and qualify the entire service for all that it's potentially capable of doing. Because most applications will use maybe 20-30% of the infrastructure's capabilities anyway. And you can always add on through change control. You can add on new functionalities of the service. Like, for example, the SAN. When we first did the storage area network, there was no need for us in this particular case to qualify the data replication aspect of it because this was a small company with just one data center. There was hardly any data replication stuff going on. We qualified the storage area network for what it was worth. And then a few years later, they wanted to have a disaster recovery site, and they wanted to replicate all of their data from site A to site B. So we said, okay, hey, let's just roll that in to the storage area network qualification package. We'll qualify data replication as part of the storage area network portfolio of services, and then any system can use it. So you can always do it at a later time. And if there are unique one-off requirements from a system off the infrastructure, you can just handle it as part of the systems validation, saying this is some unique functionality that you want. This part of the service that's carved out is carved out specifically for System A, and that will be tested and validated as part of System A, and this is not something that we are going to support as a service throughout the organization. So the design specs are fairly straightforward. You would want to capture how this service is uniquely designed or configured to meet your needs, and anything that's default, obviously, you don't go crazy into documenting all of that, but anything specific, anything tweaked, any tweaks that you've done, etc., you want to document so you can build your system back up potentially from your design specs if you have to. And that kind of translates to your IQ. The OQ would test out all of your functionality, and you would tie them all up in a pretty bow with a summary report. Wow, that was easy. We did it. Now what? Let's forget about it, right? And that's a picture of. I couldn't get a picture of me changing my kids' diapers, and I wasn't really sure if that was appropriate anyway. So, like anything else, we can't just give them a bath and put on a diaper and walk away. We obviously have to constantly maintain and take care of our babies, and in this case, our baby is our network infrastructure. So we need to have a way of continuing to maintain this in a state of compliance or in a state of qualification. So obviously some of your processes that you need would be change control and CAPAs, in case you run into issues, etc. You also need procedures for, install procedures. Like, for example, you have You've qualified your storage area network, and you've built your series of filers based on a set of procedures. You want to use those procedures and seal those procedures so that can be used repeatedly for setting up your new set of filers, or new ESX hosts, for example. Once you do that, you also need to have operation and maintenance procedures. How do you keep your infrastructure humming, purring, in good condition? The deployment piece is also very useful, meaning I've qualified my virtual infrastructure. I know how to, all of my existing hosts have been qualified, no problem. What do I do when I add a new host, a new ESX host? How do I do this? How do I deploy a new host? Well, you do this, you run the installation procedure, then you run your IQ, that's done. So that process has to be documented somewhere. It's either documented as part of your infrastructure qualification procedure itself or as a separate deployment procedure if you need it. And also deployment of, so you have a large storage area network, you have a new system coming on board. How does that new system owner or system manager come and ask you or request you for new storage? What is the functionality that you support as a qualified as a qualified infrastructure? So those are forms and service level agreements that you have between the infrastructure service and your system, so that you could clearly establish, hey, we can provide you, data replication, we can do this, we can do that. Anything more, we have to talk to our compliance guys and see if this rolls in as part of your validation, or if it, we need to consider adding it as part of new functionality for our infrastructure. So, those are some of the things that we have to get into. I think I've kind of stuck to time. Phew, that was easy. I'm always amazed at how kids can pretty much do things and learn things in fairly quick time. Hopefully, I've kind of given you a flavor of how you can go about handling a task like this. Can 28 minutes or 30 minutes truly cover every issue or every problem that you may encounter? Absolutely not. But like I said, and like Becky said earlier, we can have some discussions about this now, and we can also further the discussion on the LinkedIn forum, where we can ask a few more questions, etc. Questions?
Thank you, Sue. Really appreciate you sharing that information, and love the pics, by the way. Just sweet. I am also very glad we didn't share the live real diaper changing pics. Thank you very much. We'll go ahead and open the floor to questions now. And while you're typing those questions in, I'd like to remind you that the session has been recorded and will be available on our website. I'd encourage you to visit usdatamanagement.com. You can take a look at upcoming webinar events posted there, as well as recordings of the previously presented topics. Very good. Thank you for those of you typing in compliments. We do appreciate that as well. Let's see. The first question is from John. Sabu, he's asking, I have a webinar infrastructure with multiple clusters. Should I segregate clusters for GXP and non-GXP?
Webinar infrastructure? You mean VMware? VMware infrastructure, perhaps?
I'm sorry. I have VMware infrastructure with multiple clusters. Excuse me. Yes.
So can you repeat that question again? You have multiple clusters, but...
Yeah, and asking should they be segregated for GXP and non-GXP?
That's a good question. There's really, unfortunately, no straight answer. It purely depends. We've helped some customers who have qualified their entire virtual infrastructure. Essentially, the whole virtual infrastructure, whether it supports GXP systems or it supports non-GXP systems, is qualified. So, their philosophy was, hey, this qualification process is actually valuable for us because this helps us stay on top of our infrastructure. So, our infrastructure is qualified, head to toe. And also, this company was using DRS, Dynamic Resource Scheduler, I think is what DRS stands for. Essentially, where we really don't care where the VM is. The virtual machine is going to jump around from host to host, depending on resource usage, etc., so that you have the greatest uptime and the greatest performance. So they've qualified their entire virtual infrastructure. But I've also worked with customers who've had separate production clusters for GXP and separate clusters for non-GXP because some of their IT guys were like, hey, we don't want to get our hands tied each time we have to make some changes. 70% of our systems are non-GXP anyway, so why do we care? This, that, and the other. So there was some clear segregation between the non-GXP cluster and the GXP cluster. Some have even gone on to have a non-GXP cluster and 2 GXP clusters. One is like their qualification cluster, so anything new they would test out in their qualification cluster, and they would roll it out into their production GXP cluster. So it purely depends on your needs. Obviously, there's pros and cons in each of these methods. Some of them are more expensive. You want to qualify your entire infrastructure. It's obviously going to be way more expensive than trying to just take a small chunk. So, but it's cost now versus costs later. You can save. The one way to think about it is if you really qualify your entire infrastructure. Then, if you have a standardized process for doing things, standardized process for deployment, then you're in a greater state of control. There's no confusion. So over the long run, you really save money. And we can argue about that back and forth. There are differing opinions, but I hope that was. I know that wasn't a very straightforward answer, but I'm hoping that kind of covers what you're talking about. We can always, again, discuss this further on the forum if you have specific needs.
Thank you. The next question in is from Frank asking, would you consider qualifying SharePoint as a platform?
That's a very interesting question. I actually. Interesting that I spoke about this topic about 2 months ago with Microsoft and QMOS, and the topic was about validating SharePoint applications and how do you handle, should you qualify the underlying infrastructure, etc. It was I did it in San Jose and San Diego, I believe. I'll also be talking about this at some point in one of the USDM webinars, and we're trying to schedule that out as well. But at a high level, yes and no. If you have, depending on the size of your company, if you really are going to be using SharePoint as a platform across the board, and you're going to have multiple GXP type systems built on SharePoint, then it makes a lot of sense to qualify the base, your SharePoint farm. You qualify the basic functionality of SharePoint. You qualify that it's going to be used from GXP. You qualify some of your standard features and workflows that you intend to, and the customizations that you intend to use across applications. The reason is if you qualify that once up front and have a proper deployment process, then all you have to do is do an IQ kind of a test each time you deploy that feature or a workflow or that library or the custom object that you've built. Each time you deploy it onto a new GXP application, you just have to do some sort of IQ checks and maybe some PQ type testing in the end to make sure the entire system is working or entire application is working. But you're not really going to do a stress testing on that individual OQ you're not going to do extensive stress testing or OQ testing on that individual workflow or individual feature that you've built, because you've already qualified that and you've proven that it works in different types of scenarios as part of your underlying infrastructure. Again, this is something that needs a lot of thought. But if you're a small company, you're instantiating a small application or just one single application built on SharePoint, I don't see the value of just qualifying your underlying infrastructure, then validating your app on top of that, because you may not be growing or you don't have the budget to do all of that. So you just want to hey, I have this box. I want to validate it for what I'm using it for today, and I'm going to wash my hands and walk away and worry about all of this later if I have to really extend it or expand it or scale it. Pros and cons, again, comes down to costs and how much you want to invest up front versus invest later in the day. I guess, yeah, that should cover that.
Thank you, Boo. A question in from Edward. Once a VM farm is physical infrastructure is qualified, how is the migration of virtual servers managed through procedures or by some other method?
Can you say that again, please?
Sure. Once a VM farm is physical infrastructure, maybe he meant in physical infrastructure is qualified, how is the migration of virtual servers managed through procedures, or is it managed through some other procedure?
Oh, you mean, I'm hoping you're talking about vMotioning virtual machines from one physical host to another. Again, if you qualify vMotion as a functionality of your virtual infrastructure, then you just follow a process to vMotion something. You have an ops and maintenance procedure to say, hey, this is how you vMotion something, and that's qualified as part of our underlying infrastructure. Then all you have to do is follow process. There's nothing major to be done. For example, for one customer, vMotion, storage vMotion, all of these things were qualified as part of the core functionality of VMware. So, and every time they do some maintenance on a host or upgrade a host or whatever, they obviously have to vMotion things away. They don't go through change control for each of that. They just vMotion it because it's part of their procedures, it's part of their qualified process, it's part of the qualified functionality of the infrastructure. So they just go ahead and do it and bring stuff back once they're done with their maintenance or done with their upgrade, etc. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Yes, he has confirmed that, yes, it is vMotion, and change to physical infrastructure qualified is where he was going. He's saying thank you very much.
Okay.
So I think we're good. Okay, another question from Susan. How long does it take to qualify an IT infrastructure for a small biotech company?
5 weeks. No, I'm kidding. That's an extremely tough question. I don't know what you have, and I don't know what your infrastructure comprises of. I don't know what your company is doing. How critical is it to qualify, or how seriously do we have to qualify your infrastructure based on your current business and what you're doing, etc. So I'm just going to throw a shameless plug. Go with someone who's done this before. Go with use somebody who's qualified a variety of network infrastructure components and services like US data management. Sorry, I didn't want this to be a shameless plug, but that was a loaded question. But to better answer your question, maybe we can again exchange some emails or exchange some discussions on the forum, and I'd be happy to clarify that question.
Thank you, Subbu. And yes, Susan, I would add that once we have a little more detail and information, we can give you certainly a more accurate length of time to complete something like that for you, which we'd be happy to do. Last question. Looks like we're running along on time. So the last question from Stanley, how do you deal with Part 11 and SAN?
Part 11 in the storage area network, yeah, obviously, there's a lot of concern, and I was talking about this a little bit earlier as well. You can validate your systems as much as you want. You can say that it's Part 11 compliant as much as you want, but if your underlying systems are using the storage area network for managing all of their data, then you have some questions. So, you have some serious questions to ask of your underlying storage area network, how it's managed, how it's operated, how it's, how has it been qualified, etc. Ultimately, Part 11 comes down to data security, data management, audit trails, and all of that. Your integrity of your data is really, really important. And, of course, you worry about how you can access your data, the different paths to access your data. Do you access it through the application? Can you log on it? Can you go directly to the OS and delete the database file or fudge the text file, God forbid if you have text files that's managing some of your data? Or in this case, your storage area network administrator could probably go in, tinker with the data or tinker with the logical units that's managing the data, etc. So how do you really get your hands around it? I mean, it's obviously a mixture of the three things that you've always heard about Part 11. From a security perspective, it's logical security. You've got to make sure that your storage area network is properly secured from a logical perspective. You can't have unauthorized access, etc. There are very few administrators. There are named users that are accessing your storage area network and all of that good stuff. You obviously have to have physical security. You just can't have it sitting on someone's cube somewhere. You make sure you maintain your data center very well, the security to your data center, etc. And procedural controls. The one advantage or one thing that you can leverage is the fact that typically the storage area network administrators are not, have an independence of review, or they're a completely different function from your actual business unit that probably creates that data and manages the data. So that's great. But we also have to have some proper processes and procedures of how portions of your SAN or your LUNs are apportioned, created, managed, deleted, especially deleted. How do you manage deletions, etc. So you don't mess with GXP data unless unless you have proper process and procedures, which can be, of course, frequently audited, etc. That's a very loaded question. It has technical answers. It has procedural answers. Of course, it has fundamental organizational answers as well. You need to have a proper quality management program in place that covers your infrastructure too, and also covers how the IT department works, how often are they audited, are their processes and procedures frequently checked, and are audits done and audits properly responded to, etc. So it has I started at the storage area network and I moved all the way up to the entire company, but that's like the mess that my kids make from the playpen to the entire house. So it happens.
Thank you, Subbu. Okay, if you don't mind, let's sneak in one last question just received from Raghava. What are the storage item changes that triggers change control tickets?
Can you repeat that, please? Storage
Sure.
item.
What are the storage items changes triggers change control tickets?
It's quite simple, really. Any change that you've not, any change to your system, any infrastructure system, any infrastructure service that you've not qualified previously, any change that you're making that's not proceduralized and that procedure hasn't been qualified, essentially will have to be assessed for whether it's going through a change control or not. But again, it purely depends on how you've segregated, how you've segmented GXP versus non-GXP. If you have a non-GXP storage infrastructure and a GXP storage infrastructure, I really don't care from a GXP perspective what you do on the non-GXP side. I might care as an IT manager or an IT director because it's good to follow proper change control processes as just good IT practice or good engineering practice anyway. But to answer your question, anything that's not been properly vetted through the qualification process, anything that's not been proceduralized as part of the qualification process as operation and maintenance or deployment or routine operations or whatever it is that you've not qualified as part of your qualification package should be considered for change control. Can there be cases where it can still not be considered for change control? Maybe, but again, I would at least bring it to the change review board team or whatever you guys have and go through that process.
And with that, we'll wrap up. We appreciate you sharing the very solid information there. We would like to invite you all to join our discussion forum on LinkedIn. We welcome your insight there, and we do seek your feedback and certainly any suggestions for future topics. We do want to make sure that the informational webinars here are a good use of your time. We do appreciate you taking time from your day to join us. So let us know if there's something specifically you'd like to hear from us. Are there pain points that we can help you address, or a discussion that would just help you know you're on the right track? We would love to hear from you. Also, your feedback is very valuable. We're needing to make sure that our management team is open to continuing to invest in our sessions, and feedback from you is the number one way that will ensure our success here. Again, thank you, Sabu, for presenting, and thank you all for joining us. On behalf of the U.S. Data Management Team, we appreciate the opportunity to team with you towards excellence in compliance. Have a wonderful day.